post-town hall coverage, The President and the People on ABC News. If you've just watched it, we want to thank you for joining us for our analysis in terms of how the presidential election is really going to break down here in Arizona. President Trump answering questions from undecided voters for about 90 minutes, and there is a whole stream of mad fact-checking happening right now on Twitter and some of the social media pages, a number of newspapers highlighting some of the claims that President Trump made, among them that we'd have a vaccine within 3 or 4 weeks, something that most experts say just isn't going to happen. The Washington Post actually identifying 24 false or misleading claims that the president made during this town hall. But the question is, will it really sway voters in either direction as we continue to watch this presidential race in Arizona? We're going to be a key battleground state. We know that for sure. And joining us tonight is Garrett Archer, our data analyst, former election analyst as well for the Secretary of State's office in Arizona, and Mike Noble, who is with OH Predictive Insights and just coming out with a poll on the presidential election. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. First of all, I guess, guys, I want to talk a little bit about these town halls and the debates that are yet to come. When we really look at undecided voters, how many people out there are actually undecided? How many people out there have not already picked their horse in the race and ready to vote for that person, regardless of what happens in the next 49 days?
Well, that's a great question. It's one thing is for certain from the last election back in 2016, there were definitely more undecided voters at about this point in time. There's roughly about 15% of the electorate. Right now, it's seeing right about, depending which poll you look at, about 6%. So there's far less folks that are undecided. And that's kind of my question was, with those folks in the audience, were they in fact undecided voters?
And do we know who those voters are? I mean, are they people in certain communities? Are they people of certain demographics, that sort of thing? Or does it sort of run the gamut when we talk about who those voters are?
I think it runs the gamut because you look at the undecided, if you look at 4 to 6% of the total voting population, it's almost like searching for a needle in the haystack. And they're typically younger voters, independent voters, ones that don't have much of a presidential vote history. So again, it's just an incredibly small pool of voters, and many of them have, made up their mind when it comes to the election.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's always going to be, whenever you look at polling, you'll always see a correlation between undecided voters and also enthusiasm. So those people who check on when they respond to the poll, they say, I'm less enthusiastic to vote. They're also likely to be the ones to also mark undecideds in many of these cases.
And so we've talked about this quite a bit, but in 2018, we saw sort of an interesting shift in suburban districts that have traditionally been pretty solidly Republican districts. And in 2018, we saw some of those voters sort of split their vote. Many of them voted for Governor Ducey on the one hand, but then they also voted for Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat running for Senate as well. And we've talked about how if Trump wins in Arizona, he's going to have to win over those districts those voters may be conservative, they may be right of center at the same time, but they're not necessarily inclined to vote for President Trump, and especially women voters in those districts. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely. And I think when you talk about the shift, it's interesting when you look at a precinct loyalty analysis. So among those that voted Trump or Biden Trump or Hillary in the 2016 election, how did they stay party loyal voting for Democrat Kyrsten Sinema or the endorsed candidate that was campaigned for by Donald Trump, Martha McSally? And you look at that, it really shows how not only polarized the electorate of the 1,459 voter precincts in Arizona, only about 120 of them didn't stay party loyal. So they shifted. And of those, the vast majority of them were in Maricopa County, but in the suburbs.
I actually have this map, so I'm bringing it up right now. And Mike, it's actually one of your maps. So here it is. This is the precinct loyalty map for Maricopa County. And what you're seeing right here is the 88 light blue precincts that are the ones that went from Trump to Sinema. What you're missing from this map are ones that went from went from Clinton to McSally. So all of the movement in 2018 in these suburban districts, and you can see them follow the 101 freeway essentially all the way around Maricopa County. I know it's hard to see this because there's nothing sort of giving you reference points, but this is about where the freeway is right here. And you can see it essentially follows the freeway all the way around. That's really suburban Maricopa County where you're seeing these shifts.
And Garrett, by the way, the data guru himself proves obviously that he is the guy in the state when it comes to data. And you look at this map, it's funny. You're probably wondering why is the Trump or the Clinton McSally voter, how come that number's not on there? Because it was a zero. In sports, we call that a goose egg. She got goose egged in Maricopa County. So really, that's really where much of the vote shifted. That voted MAGA or Trump in 2016. However, 2018, they pulled the lever for Kyrsten Sinema, the Democrat.
Is it possible in Arizona to win statewide if you don't win Maricopa County?
There's literally been one person in the last decade, and that was Diane Douglas, Republican running for superintendent of public instruction, so a down ticket race. And she lost Maricopa County only by, I think, a few points or 1 point. Lost, of course, in Pima County, which is heavy Democrat, but won massive in rural Arizona. And even then, she still only won statewide by less than 1 percentage point. So outside that one outlier, the road to statewide, the path to victory as a Republican, you have to carry Maricopa County, hence why it is literally the most spent on media market in the country right now. And last 3 weeks alone, it was the number one in the country.
We're certainly seeing millions and millions of dollars pour into Maricopa County, which tells you how important this is as a battleground state. Let's take a look, though, at some of the poll numbers, Mike, that you've just come out with just recently in the Trump-Biden race, and it shows Biden with a pretty healthy lead in all of this right now. You've got him at a 10-point lead. Some other polls have also shown a pretty healthy lead. There was a CBS News poll that showed a little bit closer at about 3%. But when you aggregate all of these different polls, it shows a clear advantage for Biden. According to your poll, that hasn't really changed since really the pandemic started.
Yeah, so it's interesting. A lot of people get really fixated on the overall top line, like this one you see at the top in the headline. It says Biden plus 10. So look at the trend line. So, for example, we've polled this election, I believe, about 9 times now, starting back in February of 2019. And so we have kept the sample the same, and we randomize it each time to give everyone a fair shot at participating in the poll. And you see on Trump's best day against Biden, he's at 46% support. On his worst day, he's at 43% support. So a very small floor and ceiling. In our last poll, he's at 42%. But remember, this poll has a plus minus 4% margin of error. So instead of looking at the number more exact, kind of just fuzz it, like if you aggregated that across, I would say Trump's probably at roughly about 44% right now, and Biden's probably at about 51%. So I think it's about a 5-6 point race right now here in Arizona. But currently, things are not going well. It's the biggest gap since we've been tracking this since February.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at polling aggregator sites, as you mentioned, there's sort of a wide variance. We have had some polls that show Trump up 2. We've had most of these polls having, Trump down about 10, about where this poll is. And what that says to me as a data analyst is that, the likelihood is that when you take all these polls together, the likelihood is that absolutely Biden is in the lead. There is a chance that Trump is in the lead, but the chance is just because of the number of polls, the sheer number of polls that have him down, that just means Biden is in the lead. Places like 538 have about a 2 and 3 chance for Biden to take the state at this very point. So
Trump's support remains very, very steady. I think we've probably seen that throughout the entire last 3.5 years, that his people are his people and they are entrenched, and it doesn't really matter exactly what he's going to say. They're convinced that he's their guy. But he clearly needs to bring more people into the tent. Is there any trend out there that shows he's actually doing that?
No. It's funny, you think I have a long-winded answer, but simply no, we just haven't seen it in the numbers. Like among Hispanics, for example, the largest minority population, voting population in the state, he's down to 60% are not for Donald Trump. I mean, and they recently did a town hall here in Arizona, a round table with Hispanics. However, I just feel it's a little late, frankly, since early voting starts in roughly about 3 weeks. And so you look at then among suburban women, he's had that problem for some time. We saw it just on the precinct analysis that Garrett showed that, he has been hurting in the suburbs and especially among women. And he still has that favorability or likability problem with women and suburban women, especially those among whites with a college degree.
Let's talk about the. Go ahead,
he does very well. I mean, he does shore up one group. He shores up, the rural community member who's also very likely does not have a college degree. I mean, that group, there was a time when that group was more Democratic, and that group has solidly become Republican over the last 4 years. However, as Mike said, especially in Arizona being a suburban state, it's not a good trade-off. To lose the suburban women and to gain a little bit more of the sort of the rural Republican or rural blue-collar Democrat, it's not a good trade-off.
And when it comes to the Latino vote, I mean, Republicans don't need to get a majority of the Latino vote to be able to win. I mean, we've seen this in cycle after cycle, where there's a certain percentage of Latino voters who are one-issue voters. They vote pro-life, and therefore they vote Republican. But if you can capture 30-40% of the Latino vote, you've got a fair chance of building enough of a majority in order to be able to win. You don't have to get the majority there, right?
I think it's just really surprising in Arizona. I've been around for about a decade or so. You can tell by the white hair right over there. And so basically, you look at Arizona as that it seems like Republicans always check the box when it comes to them. They don't really put a long, sustained, like this is a long-term strategic effort with Hispanics. Because what's interesting is that Hispanics definitely line up more value-wise with Republicans than Democrats. However, they most identify and more vote for Democrats because I think they've really invested the time and have stayed committed to that voting block. And I think with this town hall appearance or the roundtable appearance just recently was another perfect example of, you're doing this 2-3 weeks before. I mean, where were these events? I say ahead of time. And again, kind of really putting that time in to start moving that those opinions among that population.
Let's talk about the Trump strategy a little bit in Arizona, because I think it's probably left a lot of people kind of scratching their heads, because on the one hand, we've seen some of the ad spending for the Trump campaign actually drop considerably. There was a week where they weren't spending anything in the state at all, even though there are a lot of groups supporting Trump and attacking Biden that are still on the airwaves here, but the campaign itself was not. That was followed by now this barrage of visits from not only Trump, but surrogates, including his daughter, and both Vice President Mike Pence and the Second Lady as well. What do you make of this strategy here, where they seem to have slacked off a little bit on the spending, but now they're actually doing more campaign events probably than they've done in the last several weeks?
Great question. So it's interesting. You hear from the Trump campaign that internals, they said they're up +2 in Arizona. And it's interesting is that we put out our poll, and they said they disagree with that, and that's their priority. But the data doesn't lie. You look at where the polling is right now, but also in the last 3 weeks, the Trump campaign has been outspent 10-1 on broadcast, which is still the best way to communicate and move voters. So you've seen that spending, but then later that day, they canceled ad buys in Indiana, Ohio, and one other state. And now they announced that they're going to be coming up heavy and hard in Arizona. So again, if things were such a great picture, why are they all of a sudden all this whirlwind of high profile visits out here to us folks in the desert? And then how come they're canceling buys in states and then now putting them up here if they were in such a good position?
I mean, there's no scenario. There's really very little scenarios in which the electoral math goes in Trump's favor without Arizona behind him. It's really only about 7%, according to 538, 7% chance that he wins if Arizona it goes into the Biden camp. So they do have to spend money here. They do have to secure resources here because it's a must-win state for the Trump. It's not must-win for Biden, but it's certainly must-win for Trump.
Is it a money crunch in the campaign that's really causing this, or is it something else? Because
they did get rid of their, they switched out their campaign manager, Brad Parscale, and then they brought in someone else, and it looked like they kind of pulled in some of redid their strategy, but also we look at fundraising. That's the one big advantage Trump frankly had in the election, that he had a significant money advantage over Biden. However, what has happened, especially this most recent month, the Biden campaign has kicked it into overdrive and has been just raising an insane amount of money. And so now the one advantage Trump had left, which was fundraising or cash, now it seems like the tables have turned, and it's put him in a bit of a tough spot.
Mike, your poll revealed something that was really interesting to me, because I think, like a lot of people, I've always thought that older folks generally vote much more on the Republican side, and yet when you look at your polling with voters overall, Trump doesn't have the sort of support that you would think with that particular voting bloc. And I know that you've got some results on that show certainly among Republicans he's still doing very, very well. But when you look at especially independent voters and voters overall, it's not so strong.
Yeah, so I try to take and visualize this the best way. And actually, I saw Pew did a really good job, Pew Research, of how to kind of show marginal change. So when you look at the first row on the left there column, you'll see that it's from our March survey. And then the one on the right is from September, so our most recent one just a week ago. And so when you look at these numbers, what was happening in March? So March was pre-COVID. The lockdown happened after that, between the March and April and the April timeframe, and that's where numbers really start to shift. And so what you see here is that among 55 and older Republicans, the red dot there on the left, you see that they're at 64% margin among Republicans. However, that's dropped nearly 20 points post-COVID. But also, you think about it, who's one of the most at-risk groups when it comes to COVID? And I think there's probably some mixed reviews on the president's handling of the virus.
Isn't that sort of a nail in the coffin, though, for a guy like Trump? I mean, Republicans have generally depended on those older voters who turn out in droves in elections to really help them over the top in cases like this.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, no Republican can. It's difficult math here. If Republican 55 plus, you've got a 40-point difference between between Trump and Biden. It needs to be in that 64-point range. That's pretty standard for party support. So the fact that it's gone down that much, that's a sign for anybody. You can't conduct an election with that with a core base like older Republicans going to your opponent.
When it's essentially untenable, because here's the thing: the way like the electorate is currently, we're looking at, it's probably about Republican +4, Republican +5. So Republicans have about a 5-point advantage. So the wisdom has been, R's vote R's, D's vote D, and you fight for the folks in the middle. Well, you could lose independents and still easily win statewide as a Republican because of that built-in R advantage. But the issue that's been happening, which was the issue that was plaguing McSally in the 2018 Senate race, but it's carried on to now, is that Democrats are fully united. Republicans are less united. There's definitely more crossover vote that's happening. But also among those all-important independents in the middle, Trump's losing them by 20 points. And so when you look at, you got a base problem, you got a little leakage there, and then also you're losing independents by 20 points. Again, his support is rock solid of the support he has. But remember, the name of the game is getting to 50 plus 1.
When we talk about not only the older voters, but then the influx that we have seen of younger voters in particular, and we saw that I think in 2018, and it's a trend that's been happening for a while, is that we're seeing more and more of those younger first-time voters in some cases, but let's say voters between the ages of 18 and 30 that are voting more so than they really have in prior elections.
Yeah, and among ages, that's a very important stat, because one of the realities is that certain folks will term out of the voter rolls, and other ones will come back in to take their place. And that does take time. It doesn't happen instantly, but we know there is a stark difference in ideologies, but also generational differences between like silent boomer generation and Gen Ys and Gen X and millennials. So you look at this and, as they come out, they're changing, and their views of 18 to 34-year-olds are vastly different from 65 and older. I mean, they're far more liberal on social issues and everything else that, again, and usually they don't have a lot of income typically when you're in 18 to 34. So you're probably maybe less worried about that whole tax rate. But when you get older and you have a retirement nest egg, taxes become pretty important. So again, you look at, the demographics how it's shifting. And remember, the biggest thing about Arizona, one of the best things we have here in this state is that our climate. It's a fantastic place to live. It's low cost of living. Again, Arizona, I think that's all. I'm from Wisconsin personally, and I will absolutely not go back there after living in Arizona, not having to shovel snow. So again, Arizona, our biggest attraction is Arizona.
I would say, if I'm going to add to that, I would say that to that point, the growth in the 18 to 34 demographic from 2018 was largely driven by the Hispanic population, the 18 to 35-year-olds in that population. The interesting thing about the Hispanics in this state is there is sort of a difference between unlike other age groups. In other age groups in Arizona, if you are white, non-Hispanic, African-American, Asian, you tend to vote after 35. That's when you actually kick in and start voting. But for some reason in the Hispanic demographic, it's sort of the opposite. The 18 to 35-year-olds actually vote at a larger propensity than the older generation, and that's one of the things that have driven that growth in that 18 to 35. And of course, as Mike said, that's a problem for Donald Trump. Is that demographic, Hispanic 18 to 35, is not friendly with him. The older Hispanics, 55 and older, that's where Trump gets some numbers. If you look at polling, you can see, a 45-55 split with older Hispanics, but it's with that younger Hispanic group that you're getting a 80-10, 90-10, 80-20 split.
That's a dramatic shift, though, because we've heard
Yes.
from Latino groups for years saying, we've left hundreds of thousands of votes on the table in past elections. We just haven't been able to get out the vote. And now they are. Is that Trump related? Is that COVID related? Do we really know exactly what's causing suddenly this surge of real Latino voter participation that we really haven't seen in years past?
I mean, we don't know. I'll start first, Mike. Sorry. We don't know, of course, is that, we've only gone through one midterm post-Trump. We do know that there was an increase in 2016. The increase was more pronounced in 2018. We don't know what it's going to look like in 2020 and what happens after that. So that's the thing with the analyzing elections, is they only happen every 2 years, so it's hard to establish trends.
Yeah, I think though the trend in the midterms though, it was that you see just a steady rise in Hispanics. But again, when you look at the size of that group of the ones that are eligible to vote, but also their propensity to vote is very much lower. And we saw that in the midterms, not only nationally, that rate, it's always been steady, like 1 or 2 point gain. It essentially doubled on the national level, but it also doubled here in Arizona. So even though they doubled, and it was a big increase compared to how they've been historically, again, when you look at that size of that group, they could be far more impactful. But again, they're just not as engaged at the moment, but at some point they will be.
When we look at the issues that are most important to Arizona voters, I think what's interesting is that your polling sort of bears out overall some familiar issues for Arizona voters. Education still tops the list. Healthcare is still up there, right, with education. But at the same time, when you look at the split between different parties and you look at, which ones are most important to Republicans versus Democrats, there's a huge divergence in that. And you can talk about the data yourself.
Yeah, so we're looking at this by party splits, and actually before, so we'll go into this and I'll talk about the overall trend lines, is that, so you look at the top issues by party: Republicans in red, Independents in purple, Democrats in blue. And so when you look at the two issues, education and healthcare, that issue is much more, you see that among Democrats, that is their top two major issues. But now we look at the most important, the Republicans, not very high in their priority list. But again, they're not going to align on stuff. So now where do those all important independents, where are they on for the issue priorities? Independents are far closer to Republican or to Democrats on education and healthcare, the two top issues. But where independents are somewhat closer to Republicans It used to be on immigration, but really immigration, it's funny, it's been talked about for years here in Arizona. Now you hear almost nothing of folks talking about it, because if you're looking at the data, it's not an issue that really resonates outside of kind of a sliver of the GOP base and folks that move the jobs and the economy.
Why
But
has immigration suddenly sort of
so that's a
fallen off
great
the map?
question, Steve. And so I think that this chart really explains it. So this is the top issue. So what is the most pressing or concerning issue facing Arizona? And you see back in May of 2019 is that immigration, or 1 out of every 3 Arizona likely voters, immigration was their number one issue, which, let's be honest, it's not a surprise. Arizona is the home of SB 1070, Sheriff Joe Arpaio. It is a hotbed for the immigration debate. However, you see that it was starting slowly in decline, and then right in about the April-May timeframe, you see that some of the March and April timeframe of 2020. You see right there, Garrett, we got to highlight right in the middle there in the chart. You can see that right there, that when you see immigration really start to dip down, it really accelerated. But what happened then? Between March and April is when the lockdown happened. So all of a sudden, when people are starting to lose their jobs, and again, we have this pandemic, you see that immigration, really voters really couldn't care less about at that point. And then you saw jobs in the economy that's basically flatlined all year, which you're like, jobs in the economy is important. But remember, we're at record low unemployment, stock market's been on a 3-year heater. So now you see jobs in the economy is taking over. So top issues: education, healthcare, and jobs in the economy. And immigration, not even the top 3.
It's fascinating to see how this has changed. The one consistent thing here, though, is that over the years we've really seen education almost always at or near the top for Arizona voters. It's been one of the strongest issues, especially among Democrats and independents, but also in years past it's been a very high issue for Republicans as well. Does that bode well or not so well for something like Invest in Ed and Prop 208?
Oh, it bodes incredibly well for them. We know education has been really become a top issue. It wasn't probably about 3-4 years ago, as you indicated. But Garrett, if you can jump down to that next chart, you look at, okay, who does it bode well with? This is where you can make inferences on it, is that you look at education, those independents, they're far more closer to Democrats when it comes to their priorities than they are to Republicans. And, right now, if your top issues, healthcare and education, and the third one's jobs in the economy, well, Democrats have 2 of the 3. So absolutely does it benefit not only Invest in Ed, but also the Democrats right now in Arizona, and where the winds are blowing when it comes to issue priority of Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, when I see this, I see a 3-legged stool where 2 of the legs are tied together and one is by itself. And that's what I see in all of these numbers. And we've seen that before. It happened in 2006. It happened in 2010. But in 2010, it was reversed, where it was Republicans and independents were tied together and the Democrats on these issues were alone. So this is just sort of where we are in the political environment right now.
Just a couple of minutes left. I want to get both of your takes on something that we'll probably hear from somebody at some point. And people make the point that the polls weren't necessarily right in 2016. At least that's what a lot of people believe, because many people think that the polls showed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Obviously, that didn't happen. Are we facing the same sort of thing now? How reliable are some of these polls that we're seeing?
Well, so let's take some case studies, right? So if you look at the ABC15 OHPI poll from the 2018 Senate race, it was 3 points off from the final vote. It was actually the third closest in the country against organizations like Rasmussen, YouGov, all these household names. So right there. And then recently, OHPI, for example, we polled on the Arizona 6th district, that Democratic primary with David Schweikert. We said her would win by 53, and she was at 53.2 last I checked. And so I think when you look at what comes to the polls are right if they're done properly. If it is reflective of the population, and your script logic's good, and you really put in these quality control measures, absolutely it can be. However, I think there's a couple bad actors out there that sometimes ruin it for the rest. And the national polls in 2016 nailed it. But what happened is that the 3 states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Trump only won those by 60 or 80,000 votes in total. So you really think about what happened was really a miss on the state level polling, which really threw everybody for a loop because what they weren't doing, there was a huge break and divide among whites by education. So whites with a college degree and then whites that weren't, so high school or less, or some college, basically that they weren't controlling for that. And so polls now are absolutely controlling for that. So they've learned their lessons from the 2016 for those. So I think the state polling is far better than it was. And I think it's pretty dead on.
Let's hope they have. We're going to wrap up this special post-Trump town hall coverage. We appreciate all of you for watching, and thanks to Garrett Archer and Mike Noble for your contributions as well. We'll see if the polls are right in about 49 days. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.